To the Point with Michael Williams.
Good morning. 2 days till Election Day. Two widely divergent views about Donald Trump from two Floridians casting their gaze toward Mar-a-Lago and the possibility that he might win the White House for a second time. And so, given all of that, my guests today, both with Republican roots, but one broke away. They have their own deep ties, as I said. Max Stipanovich, a legendary Florida political strategist whose voice was influential during the 2000 Bush-Gore vote recount in Florida, among other things. He's retired, calls Tallahassee home, calls himself non-party affiliated. In 2016, he supported Hillary Clinton, signaling his break with the GOP. And today, he is a Kamala Harris supporter.
Well, it is my considered opinion, and I mean considered, that Donald Trump is in fact a danger to American democracy. You know, there's been a lot of discussion this week about whether he's a fascist or not, and I know a fair amount about that sort of thing. And you know, I think that fascism is more of an attitude than necessarily an ideology, and he's certainly got the attitude of an authoritarian, anti-democratic. He's a cult leader, and I believe he's dangerous. And so while a lot of people are worried about, you know, the price of eggs or a gallon of gas, I'm worried about the Republic. And that's why I'm voting against Donald Trump and for Kamala Harris. I'm deadly serious when I say Donald Trump is a threat to the country I fought for, the public service I've rendered to my state and my country. I'm nothing special, but I'm special enough to know a bad guy when I see one. If, you know, to put it down at a level that maybe everybody can understand, if we were in the 5th grade together, I would fight him every week, and my dad would buy me ice cream. He doesn't mean half of what he says. Why are they speaking? And if he does mean what he says, as I said, he's a danger. And it's not like he's new on the scene and people are guessing who he might be, like it was in 2016. We've seen it. We've heard it with our own eyes. I know that, you know, people try to gaslight folks about Trump, but it's like the insurrection on January 6th. Oh, he did this or he meant that. No, I watched it. I saw him incite the insurrection from election day until it happened. And then I saw him sit there and incite them that morning on the ellipse. And then he goes and sits in the White House and finally, when it's clear it's not going to succeed, he sends out one ass-covering tweet. So this isn't a question of interpretation. You either believe what you see or you don't.
What do you say to Republicans like Mitch McConnell and others who early on after the 6th were critical and have since bitten their tongues or changed their views?
They're cowards. They prefer public office. They place their ambition over their country.
Another view now, this one from Peter Feaman, a local lawyer and Florida GOP National Committeeman. I began by asking about that charge from Stipanovich that Donald Trump is, quote, anti-democratic.
And that charge may have carried some question marks with it back in 2015 or 2016. But now we have the opportunity to look back on the 4 years that Mr. Trump was the president. And if you look at it all in all, discounting what people say about January 6th, which is after the fact, but his 4 years as president, I think if you look at it objectively, people will see that we became energy self-sufficient for the first time since the creation of the Department of Energy back in the 70s. Inflation was low, interest rates were low. And I think people look back and say, you know, maybe those charges that people said he would be are not so true. And now we have a track record to point to it. So I like to say, like to use the sports analogy, point to the scoreboard. There's a track record here, and the track record, the scoreboard was pretty good for the 2017 through 2020 time period.
The former president's critics, including Mr. Stipanovich, say you cannot discount January 6th, that it was the most anti-democratic scene we've seen, certainly in modern times. And so you can't just wave away January 6th.
Well, I've analyzed pretty carefully now Mr. Trump's words on that day. And so I discount what those critics say about January 6th. I also look at what the committee did in Congress, and they made it so lopsided as to lose their credibility. They didn't let any Republicans on except those that hated Donald Trump. And if you remember, the Speaker of the House at that time said, the Republican Speaker, Republican leader of the House said, this is a biased committee. I don't want anything to do with this. So, we need to move past that, in my judgment, and look at the track record of 4 years actually as president, and not cherry pick something that at that time was clearly an aberration.
Look ahead to Tuesday. Thoughts?
We are very cautiously optimistic. Donald Trump has laid out a plan for America, which we think is positive, very good. And his opponent has not laid out a plan, but simply has fallen back on an old Democrat strategy, which is to attack, to divert from the fact that they do not have a plan. So we think that the American people are going to see through that. We're optimistic, and we look forward to getting America back on track.
Joined now by our longtime WPTV political analyst, Brian Crowley. You heard the widely divergent views, one rock-ribbed Republican, one former rock-ribbed Republican. Thoughts?
Well, it's an interesting thing that's been happening for some years now in the Republican Party. I knew Max Stipanovich for many years when he helped elect 2 Florida Republican governors, Bob Martinez and Jeb Bush. He's a former Marine. He takes his patriotism very, very seriously. He's also an intellectual. He does a lot of deep research about world history and American history. And I can understand his very strong feelings about what happened on January 6th. Peter Feaman, on the other hand, is sort of dismissive about what happened about January 6th and is looking what he considers to be 4 years of the Trump administration moving forward on policies that Republicans care about. But, and I think that, for Max Stipanovich, he might have agreed with Peter Feaman on some of the policy issues coming just from old school Republican thinking, but he's never going to agree with somebody pulling the kind of stunts and the crisis that we had on January 6th. I think Max Stipanovich believes that the former president should have intervened early, should have condemned it early, should have done something to help protect his vice president, and Peter Feaman sees it in a different way.
Critics and actually supporters. Critics have marveled, and even supporters of the former president said early on, focus like a laser on the economy, pocketbook issues, focus like a laser on immigration, issues at the border. You hear Peter Feaman saying that. Many have scratched their heads at the fact that the former president, in terms of message discipline, hasn't done nearly as much as they want. But fundamentally, that's the decision on the Republican side. We'll get to Kamala Harris in a moment, that people will make within and without the party. The fence sitters, if you haven't voted already, I know many of you have, that's the fundamental choice you're going to be making there, where you're sitting. It's fascinating.
Well, you've heard it from me before. I always say the economy is the #1 issue, and if it's really good, then the incumbent or the party that's helped make that economy, voters support. But, part of the problem that, Trump has spoken a lot about the economy. He speaks a lot about the border crisis, but it's also cloaked in all of his other language and things that he condemns. But it's a big issue for him, and I think part of the reason that this country seems to still be 50-50 as we approach this election is that there's the Trump lovers, if you will, because the MAGA crowd really loves him, but then there's a group of Republicans and independents out there, and I'm sure the Trump folks are hoping some Democrats who truly are still worried about the economy, and they think he can fix it.
We talked, of course, because we're the only community that has somebody who in our backyard, it potentially could be president yet again. And so it's fascinating. So we wanted to focus on those interviews. But let's talk about Kamala Harris. The same argument can be made. You can argue that has tried to become, as so many do, tack more to the center. Her critics argue that she cannot ignore the fact that she's, in their opinion, been too considerate, too mindful of far-left interest in her party, of woke politics, of an administration that did, in their opinion, very little to nothing on the border until it became a major issue. So it's the same dichotomy when you walk into that booth. Who are you voting for? Who you hope they were or will be, or what the record says or what the critics say. And I don't know if people break it down quite that way, as viscerally, but your sense when we now turn the debate to Kamala Harris.
Well, when you point to the border, which obviously Donald Trump, vigorously uses as part of his campaign, despite the fact that when he had his 4 years to build a wall and Mexico was going to pay for it, he built very little new wall, and Mexico didn't pay a dime. But with the economy, again, the big issue, Harris and Joe Biden like to talk about the broad economy. There's been big improvements in the stock market. There's, unemployment is down. There's a lot of improvements in the economy. But it's not the kind of improvements that have yet reached the grocery shelves. It's not the kind of improvements that have made people feel better about their day-to-day living. And that's something that Donald Trump can feed on. And the problem for Kamala Harris, whether it's the economy or the border, the Republicans point out her and say, you've been in the White House for nearly 4 years. What did you do to fix it? And, it's not an easy answer for her, and she tends to talk around those issues.
And the criticism of her has been she talks in overly broad generalities and cannot be or will not be pinned down on what will you do, especially since we argue, her critics say, that you haven't done it till date.
I think she tries to show a little loyalty to Joe Biden and to the administration, and she doesn't want to criticize them too severely, so she talks more about what she'd like to do in the future. But if you ask her specific questions, as often the media tries to do with her about the previous policies and how they go forward, she tends to dodge those questions. Briefly,
because we're going to move on to amendments and we'll carry this conversation to our second block, abortion as a driver of voting, early voting, and as a driver on Tuesday. The former president has said up to the states to decide. We'll talk about Amendment 4 in a moment. Kamala Harris, fierce protector, she says, of reproductive rights. How much of a driver do you see that being come Election Day, and what we'll see and how people voted to date?
Well, you know that I'm a big fan of polls.
Yeah.
I think most of them are awful. But, it's interesting that if we believe that right now everything is 50-50, Democrats believe that abortion would be this huge issue that would really drive out the vote, that they would have a chance to take back a lot of, and there was some evidence of that in the 2022 election.
The midterms.
In midterms, but I don't know. It's, there's a great ad that they're running that has a guy who's voting strongly for Trump, and the wife is kind of nodding like she's going to, and then she fills in for Harris, so it's a secret ballot, so who knows?
We'll pick it up on the other side of the break. More with Brian in just a moment.